Okay, so this is going to be a good one. Confusing to some, maybe interesting to others. We'll see. What I have here is what I've decided to do with the turn signal, slip ring, quick release. I'm sure that if you go back through my post, you'll kind of figure out there's a lot going on here. So, step one was build this assembly. You can see it's temporary, bolts are too long and stuff, but what my goal is if you can see that line right there. That line right there is the outline of my race pack. This is a template for a race pack IQ3. Okay, so if I were to put this right down on the steering shaft, you can see now I'm way in there. I can almost fit under the body, just barely. But you can see before I had this eyebrow where I would have had to cut the body of the car, which I thought about doing. Of course, I'm not 100% sure this is up high enough yet, so I might even have more clearance. I think my door is a little low, actually, right now. I know it looks okay right now, but this has probably got to go up a bit because the door is definitely not straight. It's going uphill right now. So this corner probably needs to move up a bit, as many people have kind of said. So I may actually have more clearance than it appears. Okay, so the goal was to get a steering wheel with a short quick release, with a self-canceling hub, with the race pack, and all that to fit in here. So what did I do to do that? All right, so first thing I did, let me pull this out. I'm going to go over to the workbench, and we're going to talk about it. But you can kind of see how I installed it. Let me pull this out real quick. And you can see I cut out the entire frame. Let me move the shaft. Okay, so now the steering shaft is removed. You can see I cut out this whole area. This is the piece that was removed. It should look familiar. You guys all have this part, right? It's in here, right? So what I did was cut this out. I kept the back 3/4 of an inch, right? I didn't modify that at all. I mean, I took the paint off it, but I didn't touch that face. I cut down, you can see I dropped this ledge down the metal gauge back here. So this ledge and this ledge are level, and it allows me to put something in there, like a flat plate, like this. So this is the plate that I designed to go in this space, right? I'm going to end up welding that back in there, and that allows me to drop the assembly as low as I can. Why am I dropping this so much? Well, one, I actually like that position. I'm sitting on the seat. I'm not a very tall guy, okay? I'm sitting on a 1.5 inch block, a 2x4, right, on the 1.5 inch direction. So I'm sitting on that. I have my seat tilted up, and I like the position that I'm in right now. So getting the wheel higher or lower actually kept my hands. If I were to grab this steering wheel, it's going to be tough to do with just one hand, but if I were to hold the steering wheel where it would be in the car, it actually got me into a position where I wasn't so close to the dash. I know everybody's running really close to the dash, and I'm not 100% sure I understand why. I liked this position, you know, for my arms. I've wheeled the car around with this rapid prototyped part in here, so I've steered the wheel lock to lock with this assembly in here, and I like this position. Maybe if I were a bigger, taller guy, I'm 5'8", so I'm not very tall, but maybe I wouldn't like this. But for me, this works out great. So dropping this down as low as I could get it actually improved things, and then pulling it back a little bit actually helped. So if you were thinking, hey, with this so low, how am I going to mount my turn signal assembly? Well, let me show you. Okay, so here is my tube installed. You can see the tube mounts flat. I've machined a flat on the tube. I'll show that in a minute when I go back to the workbench. And it's actually below the surface of this. You can see there's another plate, thickness, 135, 10 gauge, metal gauge, drop down. And my bearing is actually installed, if you look carefully, my bearing is installed from the bottom. You see the bearing is actually in here, and it fits through a slot. It actually has some adjustment. I'll show that later too. In order to get this to work though, right, you can see that pushes it way back up. I'm actually going to cut a slot in this that is at the position of the dash, but also the width of the race pack, because the race pack has this notch you can see right here on the bottom, and I'm going to drop that notch all the way down till it's almost touching the steering shaft. I mean, I'll leave 16th clearance or whatever. And the race pack's plastic frame would fit just nestled inside this. You know, it'll be kind of like that, but further back. And it won't obstruct the view of the screen or anything like that. And it's only going to go in 250 thousandths or 300 thousandths, something like that. So the amount of material I'm actually going to cut out of this isn't really going to weaken it very much. My bearing is still fully supported, and I've driven the bushing, the plastic bushing, farther back and farther forward. So my plastic bushing is going to be way longer, like twice as long as Russ's, and I'm going to cut through that. You'll see that when it's finished. But let me go to the workbench. Okay, so let's show a couple different things here back at the work table. Ignore this, that's from my race car. So this is how Russ's assembly works. Russ has a base bracket, and nothing against Russ. His assembly is meant to do something different, and I think he did a great job. But this is that plate, and it was meant to go all the way back and mount into that 3/4 inch material that's actually behind where mine is. So if you compared it to mine would actually be much further ahead. Okay, but my bearing actually would be in about the same spot. Close. So Russ has an adapter plate and then the base plate, okay? And it takes a tapered screw that goes in here, okay? It'll be difficult for me to fully assemble this on the table, but hang on. I'll do my best. Okay, so Russ's assembly depends upon two 82-degree countersunk 3/8 bolts that come through these two plates. So you mount this plate on your car, right, with these holes, and then there's a spacer. So you can see that there's some thickness to this assembly. It's these are two pieces of 12 gauge. So it is about 105 thickness. So this is about 210 thousandths thick, give or take. Then Russ has his bearing, or the Factory 5 bearing, mounted here, right? And then there's some nylock nuts here that hold it all together. So the bearing is on top of these plates, okay? So what I did, and then let me look at the tube, show you the tube. Here's Russ's tube, okay? So it's a thin wall tube, has a bushing inside. It has some fish mouth type spacers and some 1032 screws that go into some 1032 nuts. And this assembly mounts on top of that. So, as you can see, it is quite tall, right? You have the thickness of these two plates, the black plate and the stainless plate, and you have the thickness of these fish mouth spacers, which are about 1/8, and then you have the thickness of the washers, which are about 0.62. And then that's kind of how it mounts. So the center line height is that I've changed it is 2 of these plates plus the thickness of the bearing. The spacers would be different because I used a different size tube. So the tube that I built is much thicker wall. You can see from the front end, if we compare it to what Russ built, and again, no offense to Russ or anything, it worked for what he was trying to do. Here, let's do this. These two diameters are the same. So you can see the difference in the tube diameter, right? So this is substantially thicker tube, right? Doesn't make any difference because the turn signal assembly goes on here and there's no force on that assembly. Then I machined a flat in this, as you can see, and that flat interfaces with my bracket, which is here. So it uses these pair of holes. This is actually the bolt pattern of Russ's assembly so that I could go back and forth and play around with measurements. So this plate would end up welded in the car. It has this sub plate attached to it, and then this gets bolted onto this, just like Russ's assembly does. It's just lower, so it drops everything down. And then I will cut a 5-degree angled slot in here that's about 3/4 of an inch wide that'll allow the race pack to drop down inside of it. Some other things that are a little unique is I wanted a slip ring where I could run the wires for my horn and my cruise control buttons and things through this assembly, through the quick release. So I want the quick release to have a plug in it and everything stays with the column, and then when I pull the wheel off, there's just a connector sticking out of it. I plug it in and everything works, and there's no cord or no buttons on the dash. I just didn't like that. Hey, to each his own. Everybody's got their own thing they like. So this is backboard to accept a slip ring that would fit in here. That's a 6-wire slip ring, and then this little hole, if anybody was wondering why there was 3 holes, allows you to tighten the set screws. So you reach up through this hole and through that hole to be able to tighten the set screws on the slip ring so it'll rotate with the shaft when you put it all together. Because once you start getting all this stuff packed in here, it's difficult to slide this in here, run the wires through, and also tighten all the screws. All right, so I left a pathway to do that. So let me take this apart a little bit and show some more of how this works. Okay, we're back disassembled. So there's a couple pieces. I have this base plate here, you can see, that forms the bottom. So this goes in underneath here like that when it's done. This little notch that's here wouldn't be kind of in my final product. I notched it so I can move it in and out and play around with the depth. And because this is on an angle, this also had a notch on an angle where I had originally made it straight. If I were to do this again, I would of course eliminate that machined in little notch. That wouldn't be there. This was just a test part. Okay, so then there is the bracket that takes a carriage bolt, right? And the carriage bolt locks into these notches you see here, and it allows this assembly to float back and forth like this. So you can adjust it and get everything straight. Of course, this is all sheet metal. It'll be welded in the car. Nothing's going to be perfect. So this gives me a little bit of wiggle room back and forth to adjust this to make sure everything stays aligned. So this would be the plate that gets welded in the car. So I'll go over there and show that in a moment. But you can see this is essentially just 2 steel plates and a whole bunch of screws. In Russ's configuration, this bearing is on top of the plate. So the thickness from the original steel plate in the car, like if my red toolbox was the original steering column mount inside the car, you have this black plate on top of it, you have this silver plate on top of it, and then you have the pillow bearing on top of that. So I've eliminated the height of all those components, right, and put this underneath that, like that. So now I've dropped everything down as low as I can, and I needed this drop section here, if I can get that slid in there with one hand. One-handed operation is definitely an art. The reason I needed this drop section is because my tube is so much thicker, right? Because I machined it in order to have a segment to hold the slip ring, and the slip ring is a fixed size. I couldn't put it inside this tube, in like Russ's tube. It wouldn't fit. If I machined Russ's tube out to put the slip ring in, there'd be no tube. There'd be no material left. There'd be zero. The slip ring is bigger than the tube. So because this had to be larger, I had to do this, where this drops down in like that. And I'll show this in the car. So this is the bracket you just saw a moment ago in the car. Let me see if I can get some light in there. You can see it keeps the back piece here, that back 3/4 of an inch stays, and then this bracket would be there. So I'm going to weld this into the car, and then that'll be my base that everything will mount to, and the bearing and stuff will mount in from the bottom. The shaft will slide in, and it'll allow me to drop my steering column a good bit, give me enough clearance for my race pack, and that's really what I want. I do like traditional gauges, don't get me wrong, but that's not what I have. I made the decision a long time ago that I'm going to go minimalist and minimize wiring and functions, and the race pack's all CAN bus. And with that configuration, I want it centered in front of the steering wheel. I don't want it, when I'm sitting in the car, I don't want the dash, the digital dash, over here. And if I jump in the car, bear with me, that's a little hard to do. But if I were sitting here and I'm centered on the column, or roughly centered on the column, I should say, because we all know that the car is not straight, or the column versus the seat. If I were to put this thing, just imagine this is my Racepack IQ3, it's the same shape, but imagine there's a screen there. Instead of putting it here, it looks awesome, right? It fits in the wheel. When you look through the steering wheel, it's perfectly centered, the shift lights work, everything fits like it's supposed to. If I put that over here, right, it's going to look totally stupid. Right? It's kind of too small, it's curved, and it has this notch to fit the steering column, and I just don't like it. I think it looks crappy, and I just couldn't leave it that way. And although I do like round gauges, Speed Hut would not build me CAN bus round gauges. They only have a couple of gauges they offer in CAN bus, and I just don't want to deal with separate sensors and the separate wiring. It adds weight, it makes it more complicated. And I know all you guys have done stuff like this, and it works just fine for you. I just don't want to do that, right? Different strokes for different folks. So I didn't like it in the middle, and to get it over top of the column the way I wanted it without notching the body. And again, I wasn't super opposed to notching the body out. The only reason I didn't is, what if in the future I want to switch to something from the other than the race pack? Now that Holley owns... or race-winning brands, Holley owns Racepack, I assume they'll put that company out of business like they do every other company they buy, because they don't seem to understand how to run a performance parts business. There's practically no one that knows absolutely anything at all, and they also just purchased Haltech, and they'll probably ruin that company too. But in the future, I might want to switch to a different digital dash. And if it has a different curvature or different shape, and I notch this body and I glass this in and I make it look as nice as it can once that peg is plugged in there, and then I remove that dash and install something else, it's going to look like crap. And I don't want to do that. And I don't want to take the car back apart, paint the body again. I'm sure you guys could relate to that. So I'm trying my best to not modify the shape of the body to get this to work. And every time I make a modification, like I make a quick release assembly, I make a switch assembly, I make a mount assembly, every time I do that, of course, something else has to be modified. My next thing to modify is actually, I need to notch this 2x2 tube just a little bit so I can drop my shaft down. It's rubbing on the shaft, or excuse me, on the D-shaped shaft here. And also because I've pulled everything a little bit farther forward than most people do. And again, that was my choice. I wanted to do that, no matter what turn signal and steering column I used. The shaft, right, the steering shaft becomes too short, where this spring, this is where the springs would go, that go into the D-shaped column in there. This spring would practically be falling out. So I need to change the dimensions of this shaft anyways. So what the hell difference does it make? I may as well make the shaft, make the hub, make the plates, make the notch, make the mounts. Like at this point, I'll just make the whole damn thing, right? You know, once you get far enough down the rabbit hole, this is what it's like. But hey, that's the hobby, and I kind of enjoy tinkering with the stuff, and I'm sure you guys too, or you wouldn't be building your own car. Anyway, hopefully that gives you an idea what direction I'm taking.